Again, a warm welcome to everyone joining us today. I would first like to present our series, Humanitarian Action and Coloniality, that we are launching today. My name is Andrea Steinke. I'm a research fellow at the Center for Humanitarian Action here in Berlin, together with Ulrike von Pieler, the founding director of Médecins Sans Frontières Germany, and Tanja Müller, professor for sociology at University of Manchester. We have started discussing the concept of this series in the beginning of last year. Our starting point was that what we have perceived as the gap in historical contextualization of humanitarian aid. A lot of times also during my own work in Haiti, for example, I have come across what I would say is a striking unawareness among practitioners about the historicity of their own engagement, the colonial histories of their sites of intervention, and not to forget about the colonial foundations of the institutions themselves, their own institutions. Having said that, this is obviously equally applicable to the histories of academic disciplines. First and foremost, my own academic background is in anthropology, so this is maybe the best example for that. So we have seen that there is a certain amnesia, a certain historical amnesia towards the condition that generated the contemporary aid sector, as well as towards the situation of poverty, inequality, conflict and disaster that are today framed as the raison d'etre, the reason for existence of the aid sector as a whole. So this is not only evident in reference to the past, but, and this is the main point of the series, actually also present in the future of aid. Now, our series is called Humanitarian Action and Coloniality, and not Humanitarian Action and Colonialism for a reason. Maybe a little bit of a background information on that. The term coloniality is referring to the concept of the coloniality of power that was originally developed by the late Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano, who has identified the living legacies of colonialism as a constitutive element of contemporary societies and institutions. So while colonialism has been framed as a historical period that is long overcome according to some, or is still ongoing according to others, coloniality is understood as the processual character of colonial continuities and how they invade institutions, individuals, and their practices, and this is particularly relevant for the aid sector. So without further ado, I would like to welcome, first of all, also the online audience. When we looked over the list of registered people this morning, we got very excited because of the variety of institutional backgrounds as well. There are many people from research institutions, from NGOs, and from parliament, as well as other interested individuals. And this is actually the kind of audience that we are after, that we're looking for the series, but also within the CHA in general, which is intending to bridge this gap between research and practice. So let me now welcome the two most important people today and introduce our two distinguished guests, Professor Teresa Koloma Beck and Karsten Noko. I will start with Teresa. So Professor Teresa Koloma Beck is a sociologist studying the globalization and everyday life under conditions of crisis. She is currently a professor of sociology at Helmut Schmidt University in Hamburg. Before that, she was a professor for the sociology of globalization with the Bundeswehr University Munich and has worked as a researcher in various international and interdisciplinary research and teaching settings. For her work on everyday life and internationalized armed conflicts and post-war societies, she has undertaken ethnographic fieldwork in Angola, Mozambique, and Afghanistan. She also engages regularly in exchange beyond academia, and this is why we are also particularly very happy to have her here today, collaborating with public institutions as well as civil society initiatives. Our other speaker for today is Karsten Noko, a friend of CHA, as I might say now, because we have engaged a couple of times already. He is a humanitarian aid worker who has been involved in the sector for over 10 years. In addition to working in Zimbabwe, his home country, Karsten has worked in Nigeria, South Sudan, and Afghanistan, where he is currently based. Karsten studied as a lawyer and is currently enrolled for an LLM in human rights law, where he takes a critical perspective on the human rights discourse and how it relates to geopolitics on the African continent. His interests lie at the intersection of law, politics, and the aid sector. He has published on, amongst other many topics, on medical colonialism and health policies and conflict situations, especially now with regards to the COVID-19 pandemic. So we have scheduled 60 minutes for today's event. Both Teresa and Karsten will kick off the discussion with a brief introduction of their positions and ideas and main points, and then turn their attention towards each other after that. Then in the second half of this event, Tanja Müller will be posting the questions from the Q&A section. She will cluster them and collect them and then share them with us. Yes, and without further ado, please, Teresa, I would like to welcome you on stage and share your input with us.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks for this very kind introduction, and also thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here this afternoon and to share some insights from my research in Afghanistan, which is embedded in broader research interests on sociologies of colonialism, imperialism, and globalization. Let me start by saying that I can only congratulate the organizers for choosing Afghanistan as the first case in this lecture series on humanitarian action and coloniality. And this is not only because Afghanistan has once more become a timely topic, but more importantly, because it's an intellectually extremely productive case for discussing coloniality in contemporary humanitarian engagements. Why is this? Because modern European colonialism never was successful in Afghanistan, at least not colonialism in the narrower sense of the word. It has been a target of imperial desires and influences, but different from many other contemporary theaters of humanitarian engagement, it has no history of settler colonialism, meaning here modern European settler colonialism in the narrower sense of the word. This means that if we see coloniality in Afghanistan, it cannot easily be explained in terms of local continuities. So this rhetoric, which one sometimes hears, humanitarian interventionists simply came to replace missionaries and colonial administrators, this rhetoric does not really work in this context because there is no history of a stable colonial administration. So seeing coloniality in Afghanistan, which one does, forces us to think more and to sharpen our analytical tools. And as a scholar, I consider this a very good thing. In this short input, I will share with you one of the most surprising insights from my research in and around Kabul, which was in 2015. The paper that was circulated also reconstructs this surprising insight. But before I delve into this, I would like to highlight one more general aspect, which seems to me important in the overall context of this series. Contemporary humanitarianism is deeply intertwined with the legacy of colonialism. The truth and relevance of this comes to be more and more recognized. But what exactly is the nature of this entanglement? There seems to be a dominant perception, maybe not so much in academia, but in public debates, that says that colonialism somehow continues to live in humanitarianism, that humanitarianism is colonialism's afterlife or colonialism's reincarnation. This is certainly true, but it is only part of the story. Because it is not only that colonial practices and colonial ideas live on in contemporary humanitarianism, but also humanitarian thought and humanitarian practices have been themselves part of colonial projects. Thinking about coloniality and humanitarian action, it is important to recognize that this entanglement is not the product of decolonization, but it started with colonialism itself. The implication is that it does not make sense to approach these debates in terms of bad colonialism here and good humanitarianism there. We have to sharpen our analytical tools and tell different stories. In 2015, I spent 2 months in and around Kabul for ethnographic research. The aim was to explore how a protracted armed conflict affects the organization of everyday life, and I was particularly interested in how spaces and places are rearranged under these conditions. The research built on earlier studies I had undertaken on everyday life and war in sub-Saharan Africa. As I stayed on in Kabul, and those of you who know this place or similar places of military humanitarian intervention, I found myself navigating a city divided into two separate worlds. One for the people who came from outside and were part of the humanitarian and military intervention, and another for the so-called local population. At first glance, this might sound pretty familiar to people who have worked in aid or in humanitarian action. The continuous presence of foreigners who are with international or foreign non-governmental organization is, of course, a common feature throughout the so-called developing world. But striking in Kabul were the efforts undertaking to actually keep the world of the locals and the world of the internationals apart. Separated parking lots at the airport, the fortified compounds of peace building and development organizations scattered throughout the city, all manned, these weren't only militarized infrastructures, they were manned by soldiers and security personnel. There were hotels, restaurants, and gyms that were only there for internationals with airport-style security procedures. And striking were also the effects these practices of separation, or one might say segregation, had on my Afghan interlocutors. Again and again, what I observed reminded me of a particular striking passage I remembered from Frantz Fanon's book, The Wretched of the Earth. Fanon was a leading intellectual of the decolonial movement of the 1950s and 60s. And in the book I just mentioned, he develops a most striking sociological analysis of settler colonial society as seen from the perspective of the colonized. He writes, "The colonized world is a world divided in two. The dividing line, the border, is represented by the barracks and the police stations. In the colonies, the official, the legitimate agent, the spokesperson for the colonizers and the regime of oppression is the police officer or the soldier." And he analyzes how this spatial arrangement is experienced by the colonized and how it affects not only what they do, but also how they feel who they are. Encountering Frantz Fanon in Kabul was pretty surprising to me. Explaining how practices from settler colonial rule reproduce in a place with no settler colonial history, but in the context of a humanitarian intervention, was an interesting intellectual challenge. What did I see? The explanation for this strange continuity was found not so much in ideology, but in a practical problem. The special arrangements were the product of a threat perception. Interventionists in Afghanistan operate in a context of insecurity, and they developed a calculus, a rationality of security in which everyone who was considered to be local was considered to be a threat. The continuity between the intervention setting and Fanon's colonial society was not openly racist ideology, but an actual security challenge and a generalized reconstruction of the local as dangerous. The problem is that the effect of this calculus of security was the same as in a society that is based on openly racist rule. What to do with this insight? It's really complicated. It is not just we have to better educate people to get to do away with colonial ideologies. It is more complicated. It makes us think about, or makes us pay attention to practices that have very legitimate reasons, but might reproduce colonial patterns. And most importantly, make us think about which practices need to be set in place to somehow counterbalance or offset the effects that especially security practices might have in these internationalized contexts. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Teresa, for setting us up with a frame for discussing. And I would now like to invite Karsten to the stage to share his thoughts and ideas.
Thank you, Andrea. Where to begin after the intervention from Teresa? That as you are listening to, you start to see many of the places, at least that I've worked in. I mean, it's very difficult not to imagine the green zone in Kabul, when Teresa speaks about the segregation and how the local person becomes a generalized threat, and the calculus for security management. So thanks, and thanks, Andrea, to you for the introduction, considering myself as a friend of Cha. Thanks for that. I think for me, what I will try to do is to speak about all the things that Teresa speaks about and how they continue to be present in my workspace as a humanitarian aid worker today. And maybe as a point of departure, actually, it's also interesting for all of us to reflect on who it is that we understand as a humanitarian aid worker. So if you read the blurb of the event, it does speak about trying to improve our own self-understanding of humanitarians. And of course, then it's very difficult to not ask the question: who do we consider as a humanitarian in this question? So, is it, for example, Andrea living from Germany coming to work in Afghanistan? Is that the humanitarian? Is it Karsten, myself, coming from Zimbabwe, a colonized country itself, and having worked in other colonized societies and coming to Afghanistan with its complexities? Or is it actually my colleague, who I will name as Abdul, who works in the office together with me, who's from Afghanistan? And so when we talk about our own self-understanding of coloniality and the continuities of coloniality, I think it's a very worthy question to reflect on, because it is clearly that the implicit messages we are talking about, again, for reference, Andrea coming from Germany and coming into this space. So I think it's very important to put that on the table. Now, secondly, then to start to think about how these colonial continuities manifest and how we see them. So already we speak about the green zone in Kabul as it existed until a few months ago, when we still had the entire aid system and the military intervention efforts that today hardly exist. And so Kabul and the green zone in Kabul is exactly what Teresa was describing. Even though it's a zone where we did not have so many humanitarian aid workers, but it was a zone for foreigners. It was a zone for where donors were located, and it was a zone that was closely related to the humanitarian aid effort. And so it's very difficult to then extricate humanitarian aid from this. And then secondly, what I also want to reflect on humanitarian aid is the sphere of policy formulation. So what we see is that humanitarian aid policy is decided and shaped in capitals, in capital cities of countries that are very far away from Afghanistan today, and very far away from many of the countries that receive humanitarian assistance. It is these policymakers who decide which beneficiaries get assistance, or which beneficiaries get a protection or a legal protection, and who gets a shot at some dignity in their life. So we see this, for example, in the past few months, again in Afghanistan, when a decision is made to cut all humanitarian funding, and the financial system today, as it were, is literally blocked. And for sure, none of this decision is made in Kabul. And when you look back at the whole concept of colonization and rather of coloniality, it is exactly this that we saw in many of the colonized countries, that policy decisions that affect the daily lives of people were made at a place that is very distant from them, and that don't have the connection with the reality of the people that these policies are affecting. And for sure that the policymakers, of course, as well, are not accountable to the people who are affected directly by these policies. And then we also speak about spaces, as Teresa puts it. So we can speak about space as Afghanistan as the country and the green zone in Kabul. But I think it's also interesting to think about spaces in line with some of the recent discussions in the humanitarian aid sector and rather international relations in the past weeks. One of the factors that are being considered as people are deciding on what to do with the humanitarian effort in Afghanistan is that, and we've heard this from policymakers and world leaders, is that if humanitarian aid is not provided in Afghanistan, the people of Afghanistan will flee, so will migrate to the West and particularly to Europe. So as a measure of containing these people that are unwanted in these spaces, therefore we have to provide a certain level of service in the area where they live so that we try to stop them from moving. And for people who are familiar, at least with many of the colonized countries, I think very quickly an example comes to mind of the Group Areas Act in South Africa during the apartheid regime, which basically decides who is welcome in a particular township or neighborhood and who is not welcome in that space. And I think that by these efforts to try to stop people and contain people rather, by providing a service, that the whole idea is we have to stop them from moving, and therefore we have to provide service. And it is very difficult, again, to say today that there is much of a difference, at least in terms of the impact and how it is experienced between people who were living in those periods in apartheid South Africa and the people who today are being contained by provision of humanitarian aid. And then maybe lastly, to
Karsten, I lost signal.
Yes, Andrea, are you there?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. The last point that I want to make is relating to the humanitarian aid worker that the question I was posing on about earlier on. So when we look at how humanitarian aid is actually conducted and delivered, so everything from the assessments in terms of needs, how the programs are designed, how the programs are monitored and evaluated. This is almost always done for the communities and not with the communities. There is a lot of talk and efforts being made to try to bridge this gap. But today, if you were to look at the humanitarian response plan from the United Nations as an example, there is hardly any consultation that is done with the people who are receiving this assistance. So it is again an example of an outsider coming into a space devoid of the knowledge of the history and how we got to where we are today, claiming then to be providing this development or assistance. And I think Mark Mabdani, the Ugandan historian and academic, makes the point that colonialism and coloniality was always sold as a civilizing mission. It was people coming from another part of the world, supposedly to bring civilization to an area where there was no civilization, and we see exactly the same sort of continuities today as we look at how the programming, the assessments, and the monitoring and evaluation and identification of beneficiaries is done in humanitarian aid. I think I'll stop here for now, Andrea, and thanks.
Thank you so much, Karsten, and also Teresa again for raising those very important questions. I have like a million questions in my head already, but first of all, I would like to invite also like the audience to already think about what questions you would like to pose to Teresa and Karsten later. So don't hesitate to use the Q&A extensively. In about 5 to 10 minutes, we will stream the questions from the audience. So maybe, first of all, what I found really interesting was one of the main points of Teresa saying that while Afghanistan is not a primary case for what we have learned as settler colonialism to be, but rather a field for imperial intervention or imperial rule, I think especially this idea, or maybe correct me if I misunderstood, that the practices, the colonial practices are actually traveling to Afghanistan while with this aid system that we know. So I think this is a very, very important point also for our audience today and for the way we perceive humanitarianism to be. And maybe we can start a little bit by discussing how also the values of humanitarianism are transported to those spaces. You know, the humanitarianism relies on certain principles of humanity, of impartiality, and so on and so forth. And I think a lot of the humanitarians and practitioners who have joined us today and maybe will listen to this event later actually would ask themselves, so what can I do? You know, so I'm in this situation, and you know, needs comes first, and there is obviously need in this space. So what is a practical way to answer that? Whoever wants to go first.
Teresa, do you want to take this one? I don't wish to be in your shoes to try and answer this question, because yeah, I would be happy to hear from you.
I mean, please go ahead. You are in the practical field. I have an idea, but it's not really an answer.
I think Andrea touched on some of it at the beginning. I think at the very beginning we have to go through a process of realizing and acknowledging the linkages and that they actually exist, and being armed with that knowledge, and hoping then to make better, different, and hopefully better decisions. Because essentially the thing with the continuities of coloniality is that when they are whitewashed, when they are not acknowledged, then of course an impression is created that they don't exist. So I think that we should start from a position where we do acknowledge them, and we do acknowledge how they manifest today, and then we can try to confront it. Because otherwise, it's not possible really to start to check your everyday, decision-making frame, and how you approach whether it's security management, as Teresa was saying. Is it suddenly that all the people around me become a threat to me because I'm a foreigner? And then, of course, if that is the question, then maybe you should be asking yourself why you are in that particular place in the first place. Because it cannot be that the people that you are here to serve suddenly, in all the generality, become a threat to you. So yeah, I think after that, then we are able to go on to the next step of then seeing, and like on an everyday basis, how we can change some of these practices that are clearly linked to a history that they should not be, if we are to serve people in dignity, and do not do harm to the communities that we try to serve.
Yeah, actually, maybe I would like to share two thoughts on this. It's always it's always difficult. This is a systemic problem. So coloniality is something that we have somehow inherited from history. This somehow works in everyone who becomes part of these settings, and there is no way how an individual alone can like change the system. But the question of how to act morally in this setting, This is a question everyone can ask oneself, of course, but this doesn't replace then collective activities to actually change something within the system. And I would see two, or from the research I have undertaken, which was ethnographic, and ethnographic research is always one person, and then you have a certain foci, and you see certain things very clearly, and a lot of other things you don't see. So this is not now a general thing, but what I can say from the research that I have undertaken, I would see two sides which are worth exploring. One of the most touching things that I have seen in terms of humanitarianism in this research were repeated instances in which I have seen how people who were in this world of the internationals, who were Western humanitarians, got more and more not only frustrated, but also ashamed in a very personal sense of the system they were part in, and how they then somehow made humanitarian principles, humanitarian values, their very personal concerns. So, this research was full of stories of how international tried to somehow on an individual level made up to the persons they had had personal contact to. So there were stories of people who have been part of the EU police mission who had then to leave the country. This was in the mid 2010s. They had to leave the country, they had to leave their translators behind, and one person moved heaven and hell to somehow get this translator out. And to make this translator come to Europe out of personal money, out of personal resources. This is not a solution to the systemic problem, and it's not a recommendation for people to do, but it is something where you can see that there is resistance towards the coloniality within humanitarian projects on an individual level. And this is something that actually, although it is not a solution, and although it exposes some cruelties of the system even more, it is something where we could learn and also derive hope. So people within this project trying to do differently and to remind us what humanitarianism was actually about. And the second thing, more in terms of maybe then a recommendation, if organizations really want to get serious about these issues, I would think they should start not so much by dealing with these relationships with the local population, but dealing with coloniality within their own organizations. So it makes a huge difference if you are part of an international organization. And I'm not even talking about Afghans in my case. If you come from Pakistan to an international organization, or from an African country, or from a Southern Asian country, or if you come from Germany, and you will have trouble to find people in leading positions in these international organizations that come themselves from developing countries. And maybe by starting to address these problems within the organizations itself, this will train the organizations how to handle better, how to navigate better these post-colonial spaces.
I think there are already some initiatives of some organizations that are trying to do that, but I actually, from what I have heard and seen, there's still a very long way to go in many organizations. Karsten, would you like to add to Teresa's explanations from your perspective?
I mean, I couldn't agree more with Teresa, because yes, what is required is a change in the organizational cultures and the culture of humanitarian aid, and changing the role of leaders becomes quite important in that respect. it is true as well that it cannot be the work of individuals, as we were seeing again in Kabul and around Afghanistan around in August. So many people desperate to try to take colleagues and people that they knew out of the country. And it's really interesting, as Teresa is saying, if this again was the case almost a decade ago, and 10 years later, we seem to have learned nothing. And I think that so there is change that is required at a sector level. The discussions need to take place. The discussions like this today, need to take place to acknowledge the history, because it cannot be that we are shooting from the dark from when we are dealing with countries and societies where we try to provide assistance. There has to be a context to the work that we do, and unless and until it is part of the culture of the aid sector to confront these histories and then decide how to deal with them and how we can work in relation to the histories to provide assistance and do no harm to people that we are trying to serve. So yeah, I think that and of course the role of leadership and the organizational cultures have to change. There's absolutely no doubt about that. So.
I think this is a very pertinent question, also with regard to like teaming up within the sector, but then who would you need to influence? You obviously have to influence the donors to, you know, change also their practices, which is an important part of the whole joint. Please, people in the audience, don't be afraid to pose questions. I will invite Tanya in about 2 or 3 minutes to pose them to Karsten and Teresa. But before that, I would like to actually follow up a little bit on the security framework, because I totally agree with you, with Teresa, and also with Karsten, that individual action is there and possible, and moral action is tangible also in everyday practices. Yet the humanitarian system is a structural framework, and humanitarians are embedded in those frameworks and regulations that they cannot entangle from, also especially with regard to security and securitized frameworks. I just like to remind everyone of back in like some 10 years ago, the German former Minister for Development Cooperation, Dirk Niebel, he has asked organizations funded by the German Ministry for Development Assistance to operate and cooperate with the German army in those zones of intervention, and humanitarian organizations are still shocked to the core by that. So they are actually embedded into those frameworks of power, because who has the money obviously has the power, and also with regards to an existing security framework that is in place. Maybe I would actually like to invite Karsten to elaborate a bit more on this the security framework. The aid worker security report just came out, and you're the last person to tell that the threats against aid workers is rising. It's the numbers is the highest ever recorded at the moment in 2020. So could you share a little bit of thought on the security framework in Afghanistan at the moment, and how it affects also those initiatives to overcome certain barriers?
Well, where to start? So when we talk about the security framework today, I would say it's partly responsible for the fact that we saw so many humanitarian organizations and development organizations leaving the country only a few months ago, and because again of this generalized threat. But it's a very difficult question, Andrea, because again, when we talk about security, we are talking about human life, and it is very difficult to convince anyone that their life is worth anything else but that which they believe it is worth. And so how to provide security management that is detached from, or at least trying to be divorced from this framework. It was, again, you refer to the German minister, but again, it's not just the German ministry. We remember again back when the war on terror started, NGOs being called the force multipliers, and intended to advance the military effort at the time to fight counterterrorism and so on. And what I can say from today is just, again, as a lesson from Afghanistan, probably that we should be talking about as a sector, is how this embeddedness and this proximity with military efforts, how it exposes organizations, especially at a time when the military efforts undergo a spectacular failure, like they did in Afghanistan, and the proof of which we saw just a few months ago as well. And I think that the lesson that we should be looking at as well is how is it that when we are in such proximity to military efforts, how does that increase our own risk to threats and to be perceived as part of the conflict and not as impartial and neutral actors. And I think it's really again, Afghanistan is a perfect example at this moment. But then again, as we know, it's not foolproof. It does not mean that when one detaches themselves and keep distance from military efforts, that they suddenly become safe. It is much more complex than that. And I think, at least even in the case of my organization, Médecins Sans Frontières, we do see that, and the reality that even after all the efforts to try to detach ourselves from all the military efforts and all the securitarized way of thinking, we have not been immune to attacks in Afghanistan. And yet we do believe that by those efforts that we are much safer than we could have been. And it's partly the reason that we do remain in Afghanistan today, and as I speak from Kunduz today. So yeah.
And I think we are all in agreement that it's good that you are still remaining in Afghanistan. I would now like to invite Tanya to the stage. Tanya, please turn on your camera and share the audience's questions with us.
Okay. Okay, hello and welcome everybody. I should also just point out there was, I think in the other chat, a discussion about some publications by Teresa, and I think there was a paper circulated. So maybe if anybody didn't get that, I think you can contact people at the CHAR and they will sort of forward it to anybody who was left out there. So I will start with actually a question for each of them, and I'll combine three of the questions that were asked here. So the first one from Sophie Terry sort of picks up a little bit on security issues, but in a different way. She asks Teresa whether, Teresa, in your research, whether you also considered a neo-colonial entanglement of counter-terrorism legislation. And Sophie goes on to say that counter-terrorism laws, for example, through screenings, can, of course, significantly impact who is deemed to be deserving of aid and who is not. And I want to combine that with a second question to Teresa by Alice von Kauberg, who thanks everybody for this insightful discussion and says to Teresa specifically that, Teresa, you mentioned two divided worlds in Kabul for practical reasons and not ideology. But she asked whether you could elaborate a little bit, because if seeing all locals as a threat, is that not already an ideological statement? So these are the questions for Teresa. And for Karsten, there are two more practical questions. One again by Sophie Terry: what would be the potential ways for more participation of the population in assessment of needs that also take into account the high levels of instability and insecurity we see during a lot of armed conflicts, and then Alice follows that up, maybe related to that. Karsten, if you had any experience with the
Okay, I would need to apologize that Tanya just disappeared. We will work on that problem in a minute, but maybe in the meanwhile, Teresa and Karsten, would you already like to answer the questions that have been posed?
Yeah, I think the first one is a quick one. Of course, counterterrorism legislation is an extremely interesting object or subject to study these continuities. And what is interesting about this particular topic is that it actually helps you to connect spaces that have been colonized with spaces that used to be metropoles, because the effects, you can study the effects of counterterrorism laws and counterterrorism legislations in places that have been formerly zones of influence, of imperial influence, but also in Europe and in Northern America. And you can actually, it's one of these topics where you can see how how colonialism and coloniality is a global structure. So how we have grains of coloniality, not only in the so-called developing countries or developing world, but we find it in the heart of the former metropoles. And for me, I like to study these phenomena because I like to, I actually, what I try to do in my research is to somehow find ways to bridge these binaries. So to stop telling this story of also the global world as a divided world, and to show how actually these places are entangled by history. So what seems to keep us apart at the same time is a history that has brought us together in very unpleasant ways, but it is still a togetherness. As for the second question, maybe I was a bit caricatural in the way I put it for reasons of time. Of course, you are completely right that if you think of ideology as a particular form of knowledge, then seeing all people all local people as threats, this is also a knowledge structure. But what I would like to actually emphasize is that different from other places we might think of, where we can really discuss whether all this talk about security has any strong empirical basis. In Afghanistan, security is not an invented issue. It is truly an issue to which the internationals and the also the military humanitarian mission has contributed, but it is not it's not a fictional problem. I once presented the findings from this research to an audience of people who worked in the field of security, and there was someone who actually spoke up after my presentation, and you could feel that he was really, I had touched a nerve, and he really tried to collect himself, and he said, I was responsible for German police officers in Afghanistan. Are you telling me I should stop protecting them? How shall I explain this to their families? And this is a real problem. This is not an invented problem. What I actually, I would like to draw more attention to these practical things, because they need different kinds of solution. As long as we discuss this in terms of ideology, we will always end up with these recommendations. Yes, we need education. But if you have a legitimate practical problem, then you need a different kind of response. I don't have this response, but I'm not a practitioner in the field. But I'm somehow, I would like to be optimistic that these responses can be found. As maybe it starts with the way certain screening procedures are executed, and maybe then there will be different responses.
Thank you, Teresa. Maybe Karsten, you want to follow up with the questions that have been posed to you, first of all, including locals into needs assessment. Then there was a question about the Charter for Change, and then I would invite Tanya again for another round of questions.
I would actually ask Tanya to repeat the second question because I lost her at that stage. Thanks, Tanya.
Actually, the computer died on me. The computer they've been giving me, and I cannot see the old chat any longer. So I think I need to ask Andrea to do that. Sorry.
Okay. I apologize for those technical hiccups. So maybe could you start with the questions with regards to how to include so-called local people into the assessment?
Again, I think part of the problem of being divorced from history is that we often think that we are moving in uncharted territory. So the systems of involving communities, I mean, in many of these places that we are talking about that receive humanitarian assistance, or at least receive the bulk of humanitarian assistance, there are many social movements that exist. The efforts to identify people in need are not new and peculiar to the humanitarian aid system, but because again we are divorced from the histories, and there is always the mentality and the thinking that we need to move with speed. So but it's going to take such a long time if we were to do an assessment and start calling people and asking questions. Yes, again, as Teresa says, there is a practical problem that in Afghanistan today, as an example, if you want to spend time doing a nutrition survey, as an example, with the rising cases of malnutrition in the country, you are wasting time. And yet again, there should be a middle of the road thinking that allows us to glean into the knowledge of people who are indigenous and local to areas, and spend much more effort to try to understand how it is that we can try to bring assistance to them. So I don't have an answer that will be a silver bullet, but I think again it is about how we frame and how we think about the ideas much more than about how we actually implement it in the end, because the cause and effects is such that once we are able to think differently, we are much more likely to have different ideas as solutions, and hopefully better ideas as solutions as well.
Thank you, Karsten. I would like to pose another question from the chat we have just received. It is mainly to Teresa, but I think it speaks to Karsten's points as well. So first of all, the user with the name Nitin congratulates Teresa for her text, and goes on talking about the principled humanitarian action that Karsten speaks about, is still imbued in the kind of political meaning of Afghan trauma, needs, and also bodily experiences in a way. So and this question is directed especially to Fanon. How can Fanon be instructive in our present day understanding of neo-colonialism, solidarity, and humanitarian aid, when ideas about Afghan society are shaped by narratives of violence, tropes like graveyard or empires, extreme needs, and so on and so forth? So actually the narrative framework also for humanitarian intervention in a way.
Yeah, I mean, this is now a very scholarly answer, but I think an important one. What Fanon tells us, and this was also something that actually, without knowing it by the time, somehow motivated my interest in everyday life in war. Fanon shows us that people who live under these conditions of violence are still people. So I think part of changing this structure of knowledge is actually changing how we think about violence in general. Not in the sense that we now think it's a good thing, of course not, but somehow social thought on violence has developed in a way that makes us reduce people whom we know to have been a victim or targets of violence, to reduce them to this role only. So as if they were not fully fledged human with lives So everyone who has traveled to a war zone knows that people in war zones, they have a life, they make plans, they study, they have kids, they want something for their future, even if it's very difficult to somehow to get this. So, and I think part of, and maybe this now refers to this ideology point, part of the story of how people in humanitarian theaters are treated is also due not so much to racism in a narrower sense, but to the way of how we think of victims. Victims not as being fully fledged subjects, but being something less than that. And maybe one of the greatest problem in the light of this question is that usually places of crisis, they don't produce so much rich, or maybe they produce interesting documents. We see how Fanon saw colonial society. How much documents do we have to see how Afghans experienced Afghan intervention? I mean, these documents exist, but we would need translators, we would need editors who track these documents to actually make them available in other places of the world. And yeah, to somehow change this image. I'm stop here.
Okay, Karsten, would you like to add to that?
Yes, my answer will be much shorter than Teresa, but just to pick up on what she says at some point, that this idea that people who live in or who are indigenous and locals to an area that has been affected by violence, like Afghanistan has been, that they are reduced to being survivors or victims of violence, and yet in actual fact, at least I speak about actually all humanitarian organizations, that in actual fact, the bulk of people who provide the assistance in these communities are actually from the same communities. So we have this thing that people who are part of and victims and witnesses and experience this daily violence, and yet they are still able to rise above that and take part in the efforts to bring relief and assistance to their own communities. And I think that once again, so I go back to my initial question about who really is a humanitarian. So if we think about the very small minority of people coming from outside countries to provide assistance, to join the efforts to provide assistance, then of course the answer is probably much more difficult. But then if we actually do realize the reality that the vast majority of people who are actually who make these efforts possible are actually people from the same communities, then it is not possible that you can lump people together and be labeling them in the terms that were used in the question.
So meanwhile, thank you very much. Meanwhile, we have received one more question that if you and the audience would agree to have 2 or 3 minutes more, because we already reached the maximum of the 60 minutes, I would like to maybe invite Tanya again to the stage and apologize for the technical hiccups, and also apologize for not having could you turn off the audio for a second, Tanya? For not having introduced her properly in the beginning. So Tanya Müller is a professor of political sociology at the Global Development Institute, the University of Manchester, and a founding member and former director of research with the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute in Manchester. So Tanya, please come back to the stage and share the last question with us.
I think there have been 2 in the meantime, and the second one is, I think, made up of 5. So I will just sort of raise a few of the issues. So there is Suzanne, who says thanks for the event, and one comment, and which I would love to hear what she says. So on the one side, an individual cannot on their own change the system, but then everybody has more than 0 influence. And she goes on saying she worked on peace in Afghanistan and other things. And there seems to be a lot of lack of knowledge and preparation for the context, but also a personal lack of respect and curiosity, which I think is quite interesting. comment. So she says that there has to be also self-reflection of the field worker, and she'd love to hear the thoughts of both speakers on that. And then we have a last barrage of questions. And I will just sort of highlight the most pertinent one that we should ask ourselves: why humanitarian crises have been caused at the beginning. I mean, then there are more questions on practical sides. I think we've sort of covered them, and also that many documents have been developed, but the change is slowly to happen. But I think we've also covered that. So I will leave it at that in relation to time as well, and ask Teresa and Noko to respond as much or as little as they wish. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try and go first, Teresa, if that's okay with you. So of course, we cannot diminish or minimize the efforts that individual efforts should bring in terms of trying to change a systematic problem. At the end of the day, it is really the efforts of individuals all together that start to bring about some change. And I mean, we know this from history as well. So I do think, and I do agree, that there's a very big space and a very big role for personal reflection. And I think it was one of my initial points when I was talking about the role of the humanitarian aid worker themselves, and how they reflect on their own politics, on their own prejudices, and on their own knowledge in relation to the places that they're going to work, and be curious enough to learn and be mindful of the fact that, of course, learning is not only limited to reading news articles and reports and all of this, but it is actually about talking to people that in whose communities you live. So yeah, I think that way then one can get a better grasp and a better balance to understand the places where they work a little bit better. Without these personal and individual efforts, the systematic changes are much slower. I'll stop.
And maybe I would complement that by saying that one could make this also an organizational task. So it's fine if every individual in an organization becomes reflective and curious in this way, but especially knowledge about the country's history, about some very basic things about how to approach working in such a context at all, how this is taught, how people are prepared. This is also an organizational task, and there is a tendency everywhere where there is a crisis to do these trainings or preparations, actually to do them, but then focus all attention on the security issues. And this is, they are relevant, but they are not everything what life is about. And maybe it's also then a question of recruitment. I will lean out very far off the window right now, but not every work is for everyone, and working in certain spaces might pose challenges which, like, for whatever reasons, not every person is prepared to face. And then it's maybe good to focus hiring efforts in the direction of those people whom one can trust to somehow navigate these complicated situations.
Thank you so much, Teresa. I think those are very brilliant final words for the session. Thank you so much. I have learned so much. Also, I think for me, the most important point is this reference to overcoming binaries in perceiving people and structures in a way which is relevant for the violence inherent to the system as a whole, but also to those affected by it, and that actually also includes the humanitarians. So I think it's helpful in a lot of ways to kind of reflect on that, and then also in practical terms, the call for organizations to streamline this better, to include this into learning exercises, into onboarding packages of the human resource department. So I think a lot of really important points have been made. I'm really happy that you have been here and discussed with us. If you're interested, dear audience, in further events on the topic, please subscribe to our newsletter and follow us on social media. Maybe don't hesitate also to contact us with questions and comments, and also ideas on how to proceed. What points are very important to you with regard to humanitarian action and coloniality? We try to bring it up in the next sessions, and I think with the consent of Teresa and Karsten, if you write to us, we could also share your contact information to keep the discussion going. So I think we have set a great space for reflection, and also this was a great launching event for our common idea of engaging in humanitarian action and coloniality, like the intersection of both spheres. So a heartfelt thank you to all of you, first and foremost, obviously to Teresa and Karsten for taking the time to engage with us, for engaging lively and being such great people to talk to. I'm really honored and blessed to have you here, and I hope our relationship will continue in academic and professional terms. A big thanks also to the audience for their interest in this topic and the lively discussion, and I also want to obviously give credit to Tanja Müller, who's still here with us, and also Ulrike von Pieler, who with both of them we have been thinking and theorizing about this concept for a long time. And last but not least, credit is also first and foremost due to the CHA team in the background, who has been guaranteeing the infrastructure of this event. Anne Tritschler, Josephine Jüde, and Raphael Bodewig. Thank you so much. Please be in contact and share more and many more thoughts about that for being better in being in the world with each other.
Thank you very much, Andrea, and thanks to the audience and to Teresa. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Karsten, Andrea, Tanja, and everyone else, and also the audience.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Enjoy your evening, wherever you are.